For 3 years, my brother sent fake embezzlement files to every financial firm that tried to hire me. My name is Cassandra Fielding. I am 28 years old, and I am a sharp financial analyst. Yet for the last 6 months, my address has been the back seat of my sedan. Not because I am lazy or a failure, but because my own flesh and blood systematically destroyed my professional reputation. My older brother is the interim CEO of our family's empire, hailed by Charlotte's financial elite as the perfect heir. He glowed with arrogance, utterly convinced that tearing me down would force my absolute submission. He was so incredibly sure of his victory that he actually texted me a ruthless ultimatum. Sign over your shares, and I'll clear your name. I didn't cry. I didn't reply. Instead, I simply waited. I waited until a silent, stern-faced attorney arrived at my car window, handing me a worn leather briefcase that once belonged to my late grandfather. The real showdown took place during the emergency board meeting. I walked into that freezing, glass-walled boardroom with the briefcase in hand. My brother sat at the head of the mahogany table, smirking like he had already won. He assumed I was there to finally surrender. But when I snapped those brass locks open and presented the document bearing our grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, his arrogant smile instantly vanished. Before I tell you what was inside that briefcase, take a second to subscribe if you listen to stories about family betrayal, quiet evidence, and people who finally stop being invisible. And tell me where you're watching from, because this started in Charlotte, North Carolina, where money can smile at you while it ruins your life. Before the car, before the fake files, there were the rooms my mother and I were never supposed to belong in. Growing up in the Charlotte banking district meant existing inside a very specific, invisible fortress. The outside world saw the glittering facade of Fielding Capital. They saw charity galas bathed in crystal chandelier light, pristine greens of the exclusive country club, strict private school uniforms, and intimidating board dinners where millions moved between elegant courses. Outsiders assumed I was born into absolute privilege, swimming in effortless power. The reality was much colder. I was always the girl standing quietly by the wall, blending into the velvet curtains, desperately trying not to take up too much space. My mother, Margaret, shared that exact isolation. She did not come from an elite banking family. She was a total outsider, and the entrenched aristocrats of Charlotte never let her forget it. I vividly remember the razor-sharp smirks of high society women when Margaret accidentally mispronounced a prominent European hedge fund's name. I remember the heavy sighs from relatives when I failed to navigate the complex maze of forks during my first formal dinner. Those moments taught us a brutal lesson. We learned the art of absolute silence, making ourselves small in rooms overflowing with powerful people. But Margaret chose a heartbreaking path. Instead of resenting the suffocating, cruel arrogance that judged her, she desperately wanted to be accepted by it. She spent her endless days forcing polite smiles at women who clearly viewed her as a tragic charity case. My older brother Everett was the exact, undeniable opposite. He was born knowing exactly how to make anyone else feel utterly inferior. He breathed the toxic air of the Charlotte elite and thrived in it. To him, I was just a quiet blemish on his flawless pedigree. There was only one exception. My grandfather, Theodore Fielding, the terrifying patriarch who built the empire, never laughed at me. He was a man of frightening silence. He never offered loud praise. Instead, he simply watched. He noticed that while I didn't know how to hold a crystal champagne flute, I remembered the exact percentage drops in the quarterly earnings they casually discussed. He saw that I observed the tiny, nervous ticks of desperate executives begging him for capital. The major turning point happened during a crowded, tense family dinner packed with Fielding Capital's most vital clients. The conversation shifted to a disastrous corporate merger. When a wealthy guest politely asked for my innocent opinion, Everett didn't even let me breathe. He laughed aloud, a cold sound that instantly silenced the entire room. "Don't bother," Everett sneered, lazily swirling his expensive wine. "Cassandra has absolutely no financial mind. She's exactly like Margaret, only good for standing in the background and looking grateful." The humiliation burned my cheeks, but I kept my eyes locked on my plate. Theodore did not scold Everett at the table. He didn't say a word. But 2 hours later, when the guests departed, he summoned me into his private, smoke-filled library. I stood trembling, expecting dismissal. Instead, Theodore wordlessly placed a massive, densely printed financial report on his mahogany desk. He tapped his heavy gold pen against the paper, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. He didn't offer meaningless sympathy. He offered a weapon. That night, my grandfather began teaching me how to read the undeniable truths buried deep within the numbers, secretly preparing an invisible girl to tear down a deeply arrogant system. My grandfather never taught me how to win an argument. He taught me how to survive one without raising my voice. Those late nights in Theodore's library were not filled with warm, grandfatherly advice. They were grueling, practical masterclasses in corporate warfare. He taught me absolute patience. He instilled rules that became my armor. Never sign a document when someone is aggressively rushing you, he would say, tapping his pen against the mahogany desk. People who say, "Trust me," too quickly are almost always hiding a very expensive lie. He showed me that true financial reports aren't just about the staggering numbers printed on the page. The real story is always buried in the spaces intentionally left blank. And most importantly, he warned me that powerful people will always harbor a deep hatred for careful note-takers. I carried those harsh lessons into my adulthood. While Everett was being groomed for the spotlight, I quietly took a low-level position within the Risk and Compliance Department of Fielding Capital. I was perfectly content being invisible, diligently reviewing endless contracts in a windowless office. But then, Theodore unexpectedly passed away, leaving a massive, terrifying vacuum at the very top of the empire. Everett immediately stepped up, eagerly claiming the title of interim CEO. He was ready to mold the entire corporation in his own ruthless image. However, the reading of Theodore's will revealed a shocking complication. My grandfather didn't leave me a sprawling mansion or luxury cars. Instead, he quietly bequeathed me a specific block of special voting shares. It wasn't enough to control the empire, but it held a unique, strategic power, the absolute ability to block major, irreversible board decisions. At first, I honestly didn't understand the profound importance of this inheritance. I had absolutely no desire to run Fielding Capital or challenge Everett's authority. I simply wanted to build an independent career outside the suffocating shadow of our family name. Everett, of course, recognized the threat immediately. He summoned me to his newly renovated corner office, tossing a thick legal document across the glass table. He flashed a charming, dangerous smile, casually requesting that I sign the papers just to simplify the complicated shareholder structure. He made it sound like standard administrative housekeeping. Even Margaret aggressively pressured me. My mother called me repeatedly, pleading in a hushed, anxious voice, insisting that my stubbornness was making things incredibly awkward for the family. She begged me to just cooperate and keep the peace. I almost picked up the pen. But as Everett hovered impatiently, Theodore's old warning echoed loudly in my mind. I firmly refused, politely stating I would never sign anything I hadn't slept on for a full night. Everett's charming smile fractured, revealing a flash of pure, undisguised hatred. My refusal prompted me to dig deeper. I went back to my windowless office and started meticulously pulling internal compliance records. That was when I discovered it. A massive recurring consulting fee paid to a mysterious vendor that nobody in the accounting department could clearly explain. The paperwork was intentionally vague, full of empty jargon and suspiciously blank descriptions. I printed the suspicious ledger and marched back into Everett's office, demanding a straight answer about the untraceable funds. He didn't panic. He didn't offer a fabricated excuse. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, looked at the papers, and let out a cold, condescending laugh. "This is why Granddad should never have let you near grown-up money," Everett sneered, his eyes filled with absolute malice. He didn't know it yet, but that single, arrogant sentence was the spark that ignited his entire campaign to completely destroy my life. The first firm that almost hired me was 3 blocks from Tryon Street. After that final disastrous confrontation in the executive suite, I immediately packed my few personal belongings and walked out of Fielding Capital forever. I genuinely believed my sharp analytical skills and my extensive experience in risk assessment would easily land me a prestigious position anywhere in the bustling Charlotte financial sector. For a brief, hopeful moment, I was right. The managing partners at a highly respected boutique investment group were absolutely thrilled with my comprehensive portfolio. They fast-tracked my application, praising my unique ability to dissect complicated corporate liabilities. But the morning I was supposed to sign my official employment contract, the atmosphere completely shifted. The senior hiring manager called me into his sparsely decorated glass office. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. His previously warm, welcoming voice had turned icy and strictly professional. He cleared his throat nervously and asked if I had ever been the primary subject of a confidential internal embezzlement review. My stomach completely dropped. I was horrified and immediately demanded to see whatever documents he was referencing. He flatly refused, stating only that their human resources department had anonymously received a highly detailed compliance packet regarding my previous tenure. That initial rejection was not an isolated incident. It was the brutal beginning of a systematic blacklisting. Over the next 4 excruciating weeks, every single promising lead mysteriously evaporated. One prominent asset management firm abruptly canceled our scheduled final round interview without offering any logical explanation. Another large banking institution sent a shockingly cold, automated email merely hours after heavily praising my technical interview. A highly regarded wealth management agency explicitly cited vague financial integrity concerns when I pressed for feedback. Finally, a boutique brokerage director bluntly told me over the phone that they simply couldn't risk exposing their high net worth clients to someone with my alleged corporate background. I quickly realized this wasn't just a streak of bad luck. Someone was intentionally distributing a masterfully fabricated narrative to every major player in the city. The terrifying, undeniable scope of the massive sabotage was finally confirmed when an old university classmate, who now worked as a senior recruiter, agreed to meet me for a discreet coffee. He looked around nervously before sliding a napkin across the table. "Cassandra, you need to stop applying," he whispered, his face pale. "Someone is poisoning your name before you even walk in the room. They are secretly sending out massive digital dossiers." Following Theodore's old advice about meticulous note-taking, I began exhaustively documenting everything. I created a secure, encrypted spreadsheet. I logged every single rejection email, the exact names of the deeply uncomfortable HR contacts, the precise duration of the phone calls, and the shifting excuses they provided. However, a meticulously organized spreadsheet of rejections was merely circumstantial at best. It wasn't nearly enough concrete evidence to publicly accuse Everett of corporate defamation. He was too smart to leave an obvious digital footprint leading directly back to his luxurious corner office. The critical breakthrough finally came during a frustrating phone call with a particularly sloppy hiring manager. While aggressively defending his decision to withdraw a job offer, he accidentally complained about the sheer volume of paperwork in the packet. More importantly, he carelessly let slip that the dossier originated from a secure email address closely resembling a well-known third-party compliance vendor frequently utilized by Fielding Capital. That specific detail was the smoking gun. I instantly knew this couldn't be a random coincidence or a jealous former coworker. Only Everett possessed the high-level security clearance and the intimate knowledge of our internal vendor protocols required to forge such an incredibly realistic, devastatingly effective smear campaign against his own sister. By the time winter settled over Charlotte, my car had become the only place no one could lock me out of. Without a stable income or any realistic prospect of employment in my chosen field, my savings quickly evaporated. I inevitably lost the expensive lease on my downtown apartment. I packed my remaining essentials into my old sedan and drove away. Survival quickly became a meticulously calculated, exhausting routine. I learned to park in heavily illuminated lots behind local churches or directly beneath glaring security cameras to ensure I wouldn't be bothered during the freezing nights. Every morning, I forced myself awake before dawn to shower at a cheap, 24-hour fitness center. I spent long afternoons sitting in a rundown corner diner, nursing a single cup of black coffee for hours just to charge my dying laptop and phone. I worked exhausting temporary data entry jobs completely unrelated to finance, just to afford basic necessities. A kind, middle-aged waitress named Brenda often noticed my desperate situation. She would silently slide a complimentary thermos of hot water across my table and let me sit in the warm booth long after my official shift ended, never once asking me to leave. My mother rarely reached out, but when her name finally flashed on my cracked phone screen, I foolishly felt a brief flicker of hope. I answered, expecting Margaret to ask if I was safe or if I had enough to eat. Instead, her voice was sharp, tight with anxious embarrassment. She complained endlessly about how my current living situation was making the family look incredibly bad to their peers. She didn't care about my freezing nights. She only cared about the vicious country club gossip. "You just don't know how they laugh at me, Cassandra," she whispered bitterly, repeating her oldest, deepest fear. Listening to her trembling voice, a profound realization washed over me. Margaret was no longer the frightened outsider desperately fighting for a place among the Charlotte elite. She had entirely surrendered, permanently transforming herself into one of their most loyal gatekeepers. That same evening, my phone buzzed again. It was a brief, incredibly arrogant text message from Everett himself. It read, "Sign over your shares and I'll clear your name." He felt so utterly untouchable that he casually confessed his entire extortion scheme in writing. My hands were shaking, not from the biting winter cold, but from sheer, focused adrenaline. I didn't reply. Instead, I immediately took a screenshot of the damning message. I forwarded the image to 3 separate, secure backup email accounts. The next morning, I walked into the local public library and paid 50 cents to print physical copies of the extortion demand, carefully sliding the papers into Theodore's old leather briefcase. The breaking point arrived 2 days later. A sleek, black luxury SUV slowly pulled into the dimly lit diner parking lot and idled next to my frosted sedan. The tinted passenger window rolled down, revealing Margaret wrapped in an expensive cashmere coat, sitting in the intensely warm climate-controlled cabin. She didn't step out into the freezing wind. She simply extended a manicured hand, offering me a thick stack of legal share transfer documents. "Just sign it, Cassandra," Margaret pleaded, her eyes completely devoid of maternal warmth. "Just sign it, and your brother will let this end." That exact devastating sentence shattered whatever fragile illusion I had left. It proved Margaret wasn't completely fooled by Everett's lies. She knew perfectly well that her golden son was entirely responsible for orchestrating my ruin. She knew he had the absolute power to stop it. Yet, sitting in her luxurious warmth, my mother consciously chose to sacrifice her own daughter to protect her comfortable position within a ruthless system. The morning Calvin Sloan found me, I was brushing snow off the windshield with an old library card. He didn't arrive in a chauffeur-driven limousine or wear the flashy, tailored suits typical of Charlotte's elite banking district. Calvin was a quiet, unassuming man in a faded trench coat. He stood patiently on the icy sidewalk, politely waiting for me to notice him. When I finally turned around, shivering in the freezing wind, he introduced himself simply as Theodore Fielding's former private attorney. I immediately took a defensive step back. After months of being systematically blacklisted and emotionally manipulated by my own family, I didn't trust anyone, least of all a corporate lawyer. I tightly gripped my keys and demanded to know why he was really there. Calvin didn't argue or try to offer empty reassurances. Instead, he calmly reached into his coat pocket and spoke softly. "Your grandfather always said you never underlined numbers, Cassandra. He said you only circled the absences." My breath caught in my throat. That was a highly specific, intimate detail from those grueling late-night lessons in the mahogany library, something Everett or Margaret could never possibly know. The deep, ingrained paranoia finally loosened its suffocating grip on my chest. I nodded slowly, silently agreeing to follow him to a modest, decidedly old-fashioned law office situated on the quiet, snow-covered outskirts of the city. Inside his heavily wood-paneled office, Calvin formally placed a familiar, worn leather briefcase onto the center of the heavy desk. When I snapped the brass locks open, I found far more than just standard legal documents. There was a personal handwritten letter from Theodore addressed directly to me. Beneath it lay the official confirmation of my special voting shares, alongside meticulous legal instructions outlining exactly what to do if Everett ever attempted to forcefully seize my assets. But the most devastating, truly dangerous weapons were hidden further down. I pulled out exact copies of old, heavily redacted board minutes, highly detailed personal notes tracking suspicious offshore corporate transactions, and a carefully typed master list explicitly categorizing which senior executives were truly trustworthy and which were completely, hopelessly compromised. Staring at the organized stacks of paper, a profound realization washed over me. Theodore didn't just leave me a block of defensive shares or a sum of protective money. He left me a complete, methodical blueprint on how to permanently overturn a fabricated narrative using undeniable historical records. He proved that the ultimate defense against overwhelming corporate arrogance is always quiet, meticulous, and relentless preparation. Calvin then quietly introduced me to Priya Bennett, a fiercely intelligent, incredibly sharp litigation attorney who had been quietly reviewing the horrific details of my case. Priya examined the staggering amount of evidence and offered a grim smile. She explained that while my grandfather's meticulous records were incredibly powerful, we still desperately needed one final, critical puzzle piece to legally destroy Everett's masterfully fabricated blacklisting campaign. We needed an actual corporate insider, someone brave enough to definitively confirm exactly where, when, and how the fake embezzlement files were originally created. I felt a sudden, familiar wave of frustration. Finding a loyal insider within Fielding Capital seemed absolutely impossible. Everett had completely purged anyone who wasn't fiercely loyal to him. But Calvin just smiled faintly. He reached over and carefully unlocked a hidden, incredibly narrow bottom compartment hidden deep inside the worn leather briefcase. He reached inside and slowly pulled out a single, heavily sealed manila envelope. Written across the front, in Theodore's unmistakable, sharp handwriting, was a definitive, deeply chilling instruction. If Everett uses her name to steal her vote, call Laurel Finch. My brilliant grandfather had anticipated absolutely everything from the very beginning. The fall did not happen all at once, because powerful people rarely disappear in one afternoon. The corporate board immediately suspended Everett without pay, pending a massive, highly confidential internal investigation. They hired a ruthless, independent forensic accounting firm, which quickly caused a highly publicized, multi-million-dollar corporate merger to be indefinitely postponed while the investigators combed through the servers. Weeks later, the final forensic report officially confirmed the undeniable digital origin of the fake embezzlement files, completely exposing his malicious, calculated interference with my professional employment. Cornered by irrefutable, deeply embarrassing proof, Everett was permanently forced to resign his position as CEO in utter disgrace. Our brutal civil lawsuit eventually ended in a sweeping, non-negotiable legal settlement behind closed doors. Everett was personally ordered to pay substantial financial compensation for the severe damages inflicted. More importantly, Fielding Capital was legally mandated to send formal, detailed correction letters to every single financial firm that had previously received those fabricated dossiers. I permanently retained my special voting shares, and a strict, court-mandated restraining order legally prohibited Everett from ever contacting me again. Margaret certainly did not escape the devastating fallout of her son's arrogant collapse. Stripped of her prestigious social standing, she permanently lost her coveted seat on the family foundation and was quietly banned from representing the family at future elite social events. Desperate to maintain her shattered illusion of control, She sent me a tear-stained, handwritten letter begging for a private meeting, desperately claiming she simply wanted the family to be normal again. I didn't visit her. I didn't call. I never replied directly. Instead, I had Priya send a cold, definitive legal notice stating that all future communication must go through my attorneys. I never returned to the glittering halls of Fielding Capital to play the role of the obedient, silent heir. Instead, I used the immense, unyielding leverage of my inherited shares to ruthlessly force sweeping, systemic compliance reforms across the entire corrupt corporation. I also took a portion of the settlement and established a dedicated, well-funded legal defense foundation specifically designed to financially support vulnerable professionals fighting malicious corporate defamation in their own careers. Looking back, I realized the most profound lessons Theodore taught me were never actually about money. He taught me that the absolute truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. True wisdom is simply knowing how to meticulously preserve your evidence in silence and patiently waiting for the perfect, devastating moment to strike. Arrogance inevitably loses because it blindly assumes no one will ever dare to double-check the paperwork or question the powerful. Ultimately, cutting my toxic family out of my life wasn't an act of lingering hatred or bitter revenge. It was the necessary creation of an unbreakable boundary to protect my hard-won peace. If you listened all the way to the end of my story, thank you. Tell me what you would have done if your own family offered to clear your name only after you gave up what was legally yours.